Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to our first History in Our Backyard webinar for the 2022 season. And let me go into slideshow mode here. There we go. All right. And I realized as I was preparing our slides, this is actually the 12th year that our organization has been in existence. I can't believe that time has flown by. And again, this is our webinar series. And I just want to remind everyone that most of the programming this year is scheduled as a webinar. However, fingers crossed, depending on the pandemic, we will hopefully initiate a few limited live sessions, hopefully later this year in May, tentatively, and perhaps in November. So stay tuned for more information regarding that, but it does depend on the local pandemic situation in southeastern Pennsylvania. I also want to mention for those of you in the local area that coming soon to the Fuge, where we traditionally were conducting our programming, there's actually going to be a brewery and pub opening up. I've seen a preview of it. It looks great. I'm very excited for the Fuge owners. Definitely look for more information on that. But I'm kind of hoping, I guess in my wildest dreams, that maybe that can become the new hangout for us if and when we can get back to normal life and have live programming in the future. I do want to also mention that, of course, being a small 501c3 organization, that donations are always welcome, certainly at your discretion. And that strictly goes to support, guest lecturers coming in from out of town, honoraria, transcriptions of interviews, displays when that's actually done, and website maintenance. So we have very modest requirements, but any donations are always welcome to help us to continue to do that work. And also, just as a heads up, we did recently convert over to a new email distribution system with MailChimp. Outlook was thinking I was spamming everybody when I was sending emails out. So I did convert over to a new system. So you've probably seen, kind of slicked up program announcements that have been going out now. And that's through MailChimp. But if you are not receiving those emails, if you know you're on our email distribution list, please check your junk mail folder because they may be winding up in there. Or if you simply are not receiving them, send me an email at mail@coldwarhistory.org, and I can make sure to send you an individual announcement. Also, as a reminder, we are recording webinars, and they are available on demand on our YouTube channel. There also are a number of other things that may be of interest on our channel as well, including some other clips of some of our oral history interviews and some other movies and so forth. If everyone could mute themselves, that would be helpful. We also have a Facebook page as well if you are on that social media platform, and we do try to keep people updated on our programming there as well. And we have another website that we launched about 2 years ago now. Believe it or not, there are no walls of honor for southeastern Pennsylvania veterans. So we created that platform in order to start collecting those histories. So if you are a veteran, or if you know of veterans in the area, whether alive or deceased, please, we would love to be able to add their bio to that website. I also want to mention we do have some sister affiliations with a few limited Cold War related organizations, including the Cold War Museum. They do have webinars as well, so definitely would encourage you to take a look at their offering on their website. They do charge a nominal fee to listen to those webinars, just to let you know, but they do have some really high quality programming as well. If I could ask again, if anyone is not muted, please kindly mute your line.
Eleanor, if you want to call them out, it's a Jim somebody and a Mark Smith. Because they may not know they're not muted.
All right, if you can just give me a moment, let me actually go in and mute.
also in my book I use but yeah, it's those side by side, slightly different interviews.
All right. I think I caught everybody. Okay. Another venue that is available as well that you may want to check out is a podcast that I recently learned about that's based out of the UK called Cold War Conversations. And they have another great list of programming. As we were talking about earlier before we started this evening, actually, there are not very many organizations like ourselves that are focused on Cold War history. So whenever I can identify something, I like to let everyone know about those additional ways in which you can listen in and learn about the Cold War. We do have a full lineup for 2022 for our webinar, hopefully / live session. Next month, we have Don Smith actually speaking on a book that he is, I think, getting ready to publish on a very interesting story about a small town in Germany that was sort of a stronghold of Cold War resistance in the early days of the Cold War. Has a very interesting story to tell regarding that, and we're definitely looking forward to hearing that in February. And you can see the other lineup that we have throughout the year. In May, just to let you know, we're tentatively hoping to have a live presentation actually on some newly uncovered data that John Schell has been able to unearth with some recently declassified Russian documents on the Gary Powers shootdown in 1960, the U-2 incident. I've heard a preview of that presentation and it's really fascinating. So I'm really hoping we can get both John and Don Gray, his colleague, live in Warminster. If not, they will be on webinar. I did want to also mention, as you saw in our announcements, that we have a book giveaway for Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. This is Mr. Kalb's, I believe it's the second of the 3 books in his memoirs that he's writing. I've had a chance to read the book. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. So I think those of you who were the first 15 to join the webinar this evening, you will definitely enjoy the book. So highly recommend it. And I do have a list of the winners that I will show in a moment. And there we are. So if you are on this list, and I think I've already let most people know, please kindly send me an email at mail@coldwarhistory.org with your mailing address so that I can send you a copy of Mr. Kalb's book. So if I don't hear from you, I will definitely be reaching out. So just wanted to let you know. And again, congratulations, and you will definitely enjoy the book. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Marvin Kalb. So hopefully I think I did get the heads up or the thumbs up that this was what I had composed is okay. So here we go. Marvin Kalb is a non-resident senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. He focuses on the impact of media on public policy and politics. He is also an expert in national security with a focus on U.S. relations with Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. Kalb's distinguished journalism career spans more than 30 years and includes award-winning reporting for both CBS and NBC News as chief diplomatic correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, and anchor of NBC's Meet the Press. Mr. Kalb is a founding director of Harvard University's Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and is a former senior advisor to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. He is also an emeritus Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice at Harvard University. Mr. Kalb is a prolific author of many nonfiction books, the most recent of which is the second volume of his memoirs, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. Chosen by legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow to become what came to be known as Murrow's Boys, Kalb takes readers back to his first days as a journalist and what also were the first days of broadcast news. So again, it's a fascinating read. I highly recommend reading it. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Mr. Kalb. I am going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go from there. So the floor is yours.
Well, Eleanor, thank you very, very much. I am delighted to be here. And as I told you all earlier before we actually took air, I've done an awful lot of public speaking in my life. And until recently, I had never heard of a club, a book club, a history club that focuses on the Cold War. And this is very surprising to me. I would have thought that there are clubs like that all over the world, all over the US, the Soviet Union, Russia now, but apparently there isn't. And so you guys are fairly unique to mix up a couple of words. And I am honored to be asked to be here and delighted. And what I will do is talk about the Cold War within the framework of my own experience. And despite the picture that you have on the book jacket, that was taken way back when I was in my 20s. I am in my 92nd year at this point, and I'm very proud of that, delighted to hang around this long. And one of the reasons is my fascination with the period of the Cold War. Think back to 1945 when World War II ended and we thought we were finished with wars. And suddenly we found ourselves being sucked into what was then termed a Cold War. And that Cold War lasted until December 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated. Very surprisingly, but it did. And we are now living with the consequences of the Cold War. We are in a, what might be called, post-Cold War period. So it's terribly important, knowing where we are today, to look back and find out what our roots were, if we're to consider that some of what happened 40, 50, 60 years ago is influencing the way in which we respond and understand Russia today. Now, let me give you a little bit of my own background here so that you can understand where I come from, as it were. I started studying Russian history and the Russian language when I was a senior in college. I then went on to graduate school. There was a terrific graduate program at Harvard. It's still there. It was then called the Russian Research Center. It now has a fancier title, which we all end up having fancier titles. And so it does as well. And one of those titles suggests that we're not dealing with just Russia today, but Asia. And it's a center focusing on Eurasian history and where it came from. And so you start again with that period in the tail end of the 40s, 1940s, when suddenly the nation that had been our ally during World War II, the Soviet Union, suddenly had become our antagonist and, in a sense, our enemy. Why? Because we should have known this before. It espoused an ideology, a way of government, a vision of the role of the individual in society, which was totally different. I'm sorry?
Sorry, I had to mute someone. Apologies.
Okay. Which was totally different from the American system of government. And so we had two antagonistic visions of society and the world in collision. That would have been bad enough, except that in the late 1940s, the Russians developed their own atomic weapon. And so then you had two nations with atomic weapons poised to go at each other. And that set essentially the framework for international relations for the next 46 years. There were many smaller wars in that period of time, all of that understood within the framework of the Cold War. Think about the Vietnam War, for example. It wasn't there on its own. It was part of the Cold War. the United States sent troops into Southeast Asia because we did not want that part of Asia to be overrun by communists. And so we committed fantastic resources to try to beat communism. And we might have beat it had it not been allied with another major force in the world, and that was nationalism. And what the communists did was attach themselves to nationalist units, such as the one in North Vietnam, and they then could pick up the energy and the allegiance of people who were not necessarily communists, but were very nationalistic. I went to Russia for the first time in January of 1956. At that time, I worked for the US Embassy. They needed somebody at the embassy who spoke Russian, who had a top secret clearance, which I had got in my Army experience, and who was unmarried and ready to leave in a week. That was me. And I ran off to Moscow and really spent the next 13 months there, enjoying it very, very much. By enjoying it, I mean, I was intellectually absorbed thoroughly with what it is that I was seeing and experiencing. I met Nikita Khrushchev quite a few times, and those of you connected with the Cold War know that for a period of time in the 50s up until 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, this bouncy, fantastically energetic and interesting dictator, was an extraordinary guy to cover for a reporter. I went back to Moscow in 1959 to cover what was then called the World, the National Exhibition of the United States. That was the time that Richard Nixon poked his finger in Khrushchev's chest and said, "You are not going to beat us, we are going to beat you." And then when I went back again for CBS, as the CBS correspondent, selected for the job by Edward R. Murrow, who was a fantastic journalist and very much my idol. And I say that up front without any embarrassment. He was a most extraordinary man. And I was sent there by him for CBS in May of 1960 and stayed there till the beginning of 63. And that was essentially a 5-year period, mostly totally in the Khrushchev era. And so I decided, after having written 16 other books, that I wanted to do what I'm calling a memoir about my experiences as a young American in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. What was it like then? What did I learn? Who were the people I had to deal with? And in my first book, which is delightfully, in my opinion anyway, called The Year I Was Peter the Great, that was a linkage, Peter the Great, the Tsar, to me, given to me by Nikita Khrushchev. When he asked me at the July 4th party in 1956, he said, by the way, he said, "How tall are you?" Khrushchev was about 5'6" in height, and a bit like that in width as well. I said, "Well, I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." He loved that answer. Everyone roared with laughter. And since that time, Khrushchev referred to me as Peter the Great, and it helped me get interviews, which I'll tell you about also, at least one of them. And so there I was from 1957, when Murrow hired me, until 1960, when I was sent to Moscow. That was the period when a new industry was being formed, the industry that we almost live by today, namely television. It was television news that was really getting off the ground. And I arrived and started at the very bottom. I might have ended up close to the top, but I started at the very bottom. And I was a writer for WCBS Radio, a local CBS radio station. And I started at midnight, went till 8 in the morning. There weren't many people to meet in that time slot. But when they moved me to daytime work, I was able to meet these marvelous people, Charles Collingwood, Eric Sefri, Daniel Shore, a whole host of really extraordinary journalists, all led by Murrow. And Murrow hired me because I knew something. I was teaching Russian history at Harvard, and on the edge of getting my PhD, by the way. I was just a couple of months away when Murrow called me, offered me a job at CBS. It took about 3 seconds for me to say, yes, sir. And out the window went my academic career, and in the window came my journalistic career. And I am incredibly fortunate to have been there to cover extraordinary figures, historical figures like Khrushchev, like Murrow, like Kennedy, like Eisenhower. And what I would like to do now for the remainder of the time allotted to me is to tell you just a couple of stories that will give you a sense of what it was like to be a journalist in the midst of the Cold War. One story is my first foreign assignment, which was May of 1960 to Paris for a summit meeting, which actually never took place. It was to consist of Khrushchev for the Soviet Union, Eisenhower for the US, Macmillan for Britain, and Charles de Gaulle for France. And it was to start on a Monday morning. And CBS had a meeting of foreign correspondents and the foreign editor, a guy named Ralph Paskman, who occasionally was a nice guy. And my responsibility was to cover Khrushchev, but I had never been a foreign correspondent before. And I didn't know quite what to do. And Paskman turned to me and he said, well, Khrushchev's in town. How do you cover him? I couldn't admit my ignorance. And so I said, I know that every time Khrushchev is out of the Soviet Union, when he's in a foreign country, he gets up very early in the morning and takes a walk. Why don't you give me a crew? And I will go to the Russian embassy. 7 o'clock in the morning, he will open the door and come out. I can do an interview. Paskman said, don't be ridiculous. He's not going to do that for you. I said, you never know. Paskman said, no. But other correspondents joined in and said, yes. So I got the crew and I went there, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning on the Rue Grenelle in Paris. The large cast iron doors of the embassy open up. There's Khrushchev walking out with 2 bodyguards. And he looks in one direction and then the other, and decides, just as he turned to the left, he spotted me, and I started walking toward him, and his 2 bodyguards reached in immediately, I assumed for weapons, and Khrushchev said, no, 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 he's all right. He's Peter the Great. And at which point, the guards hadn't a clue as to what Khrushchev was saying, but they put their guns back in. I approached as we started walking down the street. And my cameraman was taking pictures of us. And I started by asking him a few general questions about his trip and the flight and that sort of thing. The end of the block was a boulangerie. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, the magnificent aromas of freshly baked croissant filled the air. Khrushchev, being a guy who liked to eat, stopped, sniffed, and he asked me, what is that? I said, that is, I think, croissant. Have you ever had any? He said, no. Just a minute, I said. I ran inside, bought a bunch of them, gave one to him. Khrushchev bit into it, and his face looked like a kid eating his first chocolate bar. It lit up. And then he shouted out, Otlично, delicious, absolutely fantastic. And I realized I had my interview. And then I went in and talked to him about the U-2, which had been shot down 2 weeks before, about whether we're going to have an agreement on Berlin, about whether we're even going to have a summit to address the issue of Berlin, and whether we could have something on arms control. And Khrushchev gave me a terrific set of answers. And at the very end, we're back in front of the embassy, shook hands, he walked in, the door shut behind him. I did what they call a close, a stand-up piece, wrapping it up, wrapping the interview up. And I realized that this was a pretty fantastic way of breaking into the coverage of the Cold War, to do an interview with the Soviet leader on an exclusive basis. So it's terribly exciting. The next thing I want to tell you about is that I ran all over the world with Kissinger. Excuse me, I did that too, but with Khrushchev. And I got to know him reasonably well. And I got to know his son, Sergei, who lives, by the way, near Providence, Rhode Island, reasonably well. And my sense was and remains that Nikita Khrushchev was a devoted communist without any doubt. But he was absolutely opposed to the collision of communism against capitalism so that there could be a nuclear war. He believed, as he said, the living will envy the dead. Think about that phrase. The living, at the end of a Cold War, the living will envy the dead. That life would be so horrible. And he decided that he would do whatever he could in pursuit of a policy he called peaceful coexistence, to advance the interests of communism without leading to a nuclear war. Now, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Berlin crisis of 1961, August, what he did at that time was self-humiliating, but also very wise. He built a wall through Berlin, and that wall kept the flow of unhappy East Europeans, East Germans, out of West Berlin, out of the western part of Germany. So it's humiliating to acknowledge that, but at the same time, you don't get into a war because of it. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, he brought the world perilously close to a nuclear exchange, but pulled back in self-humiliation, because as he explained later, no matter what might have happened, maybe successfully he would have built an advanced nuclear jumping off point for an attack against the United States. But as he said, he could have done that with long-range missiles from the Soviet Union. He didn't have to do that. He did it because the idea that we had missiles in Turkey pointing at the Soviet Union, in other words, a country so close to the Soviet Union with American nuclear-tipped missiles being able to fire at the Soviet Union, it bothered him. And on a day in May of 1962, while walking on a beach in Bulgaria, he looked across the Black Sea, looked at Turkey, and he said, if American missiles can be there, then our missiles can be in Cuba. That crazy idea stuck in his mind and became a very dangerous policy. And were it not for the wisdom of John Kennedy operating in that environment, and were it not for the fact that Khrushchev would do anything to avoid a nuclear war, these two leaders backed off and saved the world a catastrophe of a nuclear exchange, which, by the way, an exchange at that time, one bomb at that time would have been enough to wipe out a city like Moscow. One Soviet bomb of that sort could have wiped out much of New York City. And that was in the minds of both men. And that was the essential reason why at the last minute they pulled back. Even in pulling back, they left the world still at the brink of huge danger. Think about this for a sec, because it was very close to what happened. If a Soviet general in Cuba, in charge of a nuclear-tipped missile, already on a launch pad, ready to be fired at the United States, if that general, in a moment of madness, in a moment of rebellion against civilian leadership, at a moment when he might have been desirous of embracing Castro's vision, whatever the reason might be, we could have ended up with the Russians actually firing a missile at us. So what we have to bear in mind, I think, about the Cold War is that for that period of 46 years, not every moment of that time, but often enough, we were in a low-grade war, one side against the other, but not in a big war. And that fear of the big war dominated the thinking of the leadership on both sides. I have often thought, as a journalist and looking back at this, that how do you write about it? I mean, I am now in this very sloppy desk, and I excuse myself for that. How do you write about an experience of that sort? What are the things that you ought to be stressing? Is it a conversation, excuse me, a conversation that you have with a Russian butcher about Cuba? I said, I used to go down to the Central Marketplace in Moscow, not big enough for a news story, but I would go down there because I wanted to talk to ordinary Russians. And in those years, my Russian was very good. And I'd like to go down there and just talk to them, ask them what they think about this and that, sometimes having nothing to do with the news, but just to get a feel for what people thought rather than governments. And this butcher with whom I had had some kind of a relationship, quote unquote, I would ask him something. He would ask me something about the US. I said, what about Cuba? You think we're going to have a war over Cuba? And he did something that Russians very often did. He'd point to either the roof or the sky. But what he meant is those people up there, in other words, the people like Khrushchev and the political, ideological leadership, he said, those guys are making mistakes. He said, Cuba is very far away. We don't have to worry about Cuba. They have their own problems. We have to worry about what's going on here. I would take that thought and bounce it off another Russian in another part of the marketplace, and they get essentially the same thing. Then you turn to a Soviet official, and you get an absolutely ridiculous explanation about how Cuba was part of the national interest of the Soviet Union. It wasn't. It wasn't. And nations today, and we're finding that out time and time again, nations today operate on the basis of national interest, not on the basis of ideology, although that encourages and kind of sets a framework, on the basis of national interest. And Putin today is very much like Khrushchev back then. He will push on Ukraine to the maximum advantage for Russia. But when he senses that it's not helping Russia anymore, if he still has brains, and he's a very smart guy, he's going to pull back. In the same way that Khrushchev went very deep into a crisis, but pulled back. I have that sense about Putin also, that I could be dead wrong. He may surprise us all, and instead of pulling back, plunge forward. Even then, I think it was Charles de Gaulle who said that communists plunge forward until they hit something steel-like, and then they pull back. De Gaulle might have been right or wrong, and I could be right or wrong on this, but my sense is that national interest will determine ultimately the result of the current crisis in much the same way that it ended up as the result in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I could go on a good bit, but I have a feeling I ought to stop at this point and open myself to your questions so that I can respond more directly to what it is that is on your mind and is of interest to you. So please, Eleanor, pick it up.
Okay, well, we actually have quite a few questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read those first, if that's okay. And I could listen to this all night. I mean, I find it fascinating. I mean, this is all firsthand history, and that's what our organization's all about, which is terrific. But let's see, I'm going to start with, where are we here? The first question, this is from Joe Ramito. And here's his question. From the Potsdam Conference to the current day, it seems that the acquisition of territory is a consistent force driving Soviet-Russian national policy. Do you think that's an accurate perception, and is it likely to continue to be an issue we'll have to deal with?
I think it is an issue that we're going to have to deal with for a long time. However, it always is up against certain realities. A Russian leader sitting in the Kremlin looking out at a vast country. I mean, please bear in mind that, as you well know, Russia runs from the Baltic all the way to the Pacific. And there's an awful lot of land that you have to somehow or another master. And it is inhabited by many different nationality groups, many different groups. That was true under the Tsarist regime, under the communist regime, and under the current Putin regime. So the issue becomes, what in the final analysis is of interest to Russia now, and why? Take in mind the Ukraine story. If you go back to 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, Boris Yeltsin, and you all remember Boris, the man who could not quite hold his liquor, Boris believed, as any other Russian leader would believe, that if we are going to lose the heart of our empire, we have to end up with certain basics in order to continue as a nation. Those basics for us, Yeltsin said in 91, and Putin is saying right now, are: one, you have to have Russia, the heart, the guiding force in this conglomeration of states. Then Belarus, very close Slavic, faith the same, all of that. You must have Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. You must have Ukraine because, as Putin said, we are one people. And you must have Kazakhstan. Why? Oil and strategic bases like the Baikonur space launching site. That is what they felt back then in 91. It's what Putin feels today. And it determines what he regards as his sphere of influence. This is what he regards as fundamental to the state, meaning he'll fight for it. But today, if you fight for Ukraine, you run a very serious risk of having to take on NATO. Mm. If you take on NATO, you're talking then about the possibility, nothing is guaranteed, but the possibility of an exchange of nuclear weapons. Then you get back to the same Kennedy-Khrushchev phenomenon. You get into so lofty a strategic level that it becomes almost terrifying. And most human beings will back off, not all. And that is where the danger slot is. We'll never know until it happens that it happens. We can only plan based on what has happened for what might happen. And what might happen is that Russians will fight for what they regard as their territory. I don't know if I've quite answered your question, Joe, but I tried to.
Okay, great. So the next question is, given the world as we know it now, many of us who have served and worked in the defense industry missed the Cold War because there were rules. So the question is, could you comment on whether you see it the same way?
Whether I think there are rules today governing our society?
Yeah, it sounds like that the question is, in the Cold War, there were rules, at least in the military, the feeling was the Cold War had rules.
Right.
He's curious
And whether we do today?
whether it's the same way today.
The answer is no, it is not the same way today. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the Western world was left without a guiding global parameter, guidelines for determining what it is that we do. At this particular point, we are struggling to reassert certain guidelines. Putin is determined to reassert guidelines best to satisfy the interests of Russia, not the West. My concern at the moment is that in response to Putin, we at this point do not have a clearly defined table of contents for a negotiation with the East. Putin does. Now, you could argue, and any good negotiator would do this, you lay out not what you think you're going to get, but way out beyond what you think so that you can give up some stuff. That may be what he's doing. I hope that is what he's doing. But as I said a moment ago, we really don't ever know until things happen, whether they will happen. So, sit back and buckle down in your seat, because the next month or two are going to be quite interesting, minimally speaking. And I have a feeling could possibly produce answers to some of the large questions of our time.
This is a question regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, and this is again from Joe Romito. It's been suggested that the Soviets put missiles in Cuba to create a bargaining chip that could be used to negotiate greater concessions in Berlin, I guess the so-called Berlin problem that Khrushchev was obsessed with. Do you think there's any validity to that idea?
Absolutely, absolutely, Joe. I have just finished a very, very long chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis for the third volume in this trilogy. And there is no question in my mind, and there was not at the time either, that I was reporting. I don't know whether you can see, but on my desk here are broadcasts that I did back in 1962 in October during the Cuban Missile Crisis from Moscow. And in reviewing those broadcasts, there is no doubt in my mind at that time, my knowledge said to me, my instinct said to me, my feelings about Russian history said to me, that when Khrushchev decided to go as far afield as Cuba in order to make a point, he had to have something in mind much closer to home. And this gets back to Mike Butcher, by the way. One of the things he said to me in one of our many conversations was, remember, Cuba is not Berlin. Berlin we fight for, not Cuba. And what he meant by that, clearly, is that in Russian history, there's the Teutonic invasions, there are the Western invasions, there's Napoleon coming in, and then, of course, most dramatically, there was the Nazi assault. It is very difficult. When I first came to Russia in January 56, it was only 11 years after the end of World War II. Moscow, Leningrad, a lot of the cities were still half destroyed. There was no Russian family that had not lost at least one person in the fight against the Nazis. The Russians might have lost anywhere, it's so hard to determine because there are no numbers, between 20 and 40 million people in World War II.
Wow.
They have that in their minds. That is what Germans can do to us Slavs. And so I'm putting that in a historical context because it explains so much about the psychology of Russians and therefore Russian leadership. And so I think you're absolutely right that Berlin was very much on his mind. He thought that if he could, in a sense, frighten Kennedy into a summit meeting, the ostensible purpose of which was to get the Russian missiles out of Cuba. But the actual purpose was to strike a deal on Berlin. That is what he had in mind. And I know that that's a controversial point of view, but that is very much my feeling. And thank you for that question.
So this is a question from Mark Smith, and he asks, did you have KGB minders following you when you were in Moscow?
Absolutely. They were there for trouble, but every now and then to help me. And let me explain that too. There was a shortcut where you could walk from the Central Telegraph on Gorky Street, which is where I did my broadcasts. And if you were to go back to the hotel where I lived the first year, which was, I would say about 6 or 7 blocks from the Central Telegraph, but through rather narrow streets. And in those days, people were very hungry. They definitely needed money. And if people saw a foreigner walking down the street, and very easy to tell a foreigner because they were generally in much better clothing, et cetera, you could be in trouble. But I always walked down these little dark streets. Nobody ever touched me because there were 2 KGB cops with me at all times. And so they took care of all of my problems. The first time, this is a funny story, I think. The first time I arrived in Moscow in January 56, I was very excited about being there. And so I went down to Red Square. And I noticed on the metro as I was going downtown, this guy was following me. And I had been told by the State Department that I ought to expect KGB followers at all times. So I figured this was my guy. And I would walk around Red Square and he was always there with me. And there was an ice cream stand. And I went over to the ice cream stand and I bought 2 ice cream cones. And I took one and I gave one to him. And much to my surprise, he took it, never said thank you, but slurped it up. And I thought that was also another example of the humanity of at least this one KGB guy. Also, I mean, they listened to all of your telephone conversations. Cab drivers, if they took you anywhere, would report back. But look, you had to recognize that, use your head, don't do anything stupid. They knew who you were, they knew what you were, they knew what you were doing. And so long as you were doing your job and not doing anything that seemed different from your normal work. I mean, for example, supposing one of those walks down a dark street, I met a Russian and we had a hushed conversation. That Russian undoubtedly was doing something that would get him into bad trouble and get me into trouble too, because I was participating with him in something the state could determine was espionage. They could determine anything to be espionage. It depended on whether they wanted to get you or not. So my rule of thumb, operating there both as a diplomat and as a journalist, was you play it straight. You do what is your job, what they know you are there to do, and nothing more. As a journalist, I can tell you that my job was, for every 24 hours of a day, I worked for 20 of them. And it was a fantastic assignment. And to this day, I think you can sense my excitement about it, even this many 60 plus years later.
Yeah, I have another question, actually, along the lines about journalism. What changes have you seen in journalism, good or bad, especially in the last few years? And just to tack on to that, I actually had a question, which I think I had sent to you just as a preview, kind of along those lines. In reading your book, I was really struck by, I guess, what my looking from the outside in, that journalism seems to have changed. I mean, what you describe in your book and how you've done your craft over 60 years is very objective. I guess maybe in the Edward R. Murrow spirit of journalism, but perhaps that has changed today. I don't know. I'm curious about your thoughts, looking over the span of time, how you think it's evolved for better or for worse. And that's, I think, the same question
Yeah.
that Davidson had.
Well, Eleanor, that is a question that I could spend an entire course answering. It is a question I have been agonizing about now for many, many years. It is a question that I think may ultimately determine the larger question about American democracy. But let me try to answer it briefly, but without slipping anything. Journalism has changed profoundly in the last 60, 70 years of my life, but in the last 10 or 15 years, most especially. The purpose of journalism in the United States remains the same. It is to find out what happened and to report what happened as clean as you can. Murrow used to say, I have no interest in what you think. I want to know what you know. And because today there's an awful lot of I think and maybe and who knows, but the essence of good journalism, tell me what you know. What did you see? What did you hear? Who told you what? Let me have the facts. I'll make up my mind what to do with them. That was classic journalism. In the last 20, 25 years, we have had introduced into this world of journalism a very large new element. So that today, journalism is divided in two parts. We used to believe as journalists that we stood above the political fray. We would look down and we would say, this guy's here, this guy's there, this guy said this guy said that, and here's the information, run with it. Today, some journalists in what I'm going to call, without any affront to anyone, the Fox News-led journalism of today, there is a point of view. You may agree with the point of view, you may disagree, but there is a definite point of view. And all of the reporting is seen through that prism. And most of the commentary amplifies that particular point of view. Then there is the other part of the media, which is called the mainstream media, which is sort of divided itself into two parts. there's one part that is classically old-fashioned journalism in new garb. In other words, the new technology, social media, all of that stuff. And then there's another piece of it which always reports negatively about whoever is in office. If Trump is in office, there's a negative vision through which you see his activity. Biden's in office, same negative prism through which you see it. And so what we have today is a journalism fractured and part of the political warfare that we see tearing this country apart today. So the concluding part of my answer, Eleanor, is that American democracy is, in my judgment, you can all have your own view, in my judgment, is in a sorry state, and journalism reflects that sorry state. And so we are all searching for a better tomorrow, and I hope we're lucky enough to get it.
Great. I have two other small questions for you, and I know we could
Sure.
go on all night, but I want to be respectful of your time. But I really would love to have you tell the group about how you reacted to the first time you were contacted by Edward R. Murrow for a job at CBS,
Okay,
which I think is a hilarious story. And then
okay,
I want to know how you got on Nixon's enemies list.
okay. First, I was sitting in Widener Library in May of 1957, very close to literally finishing my dissertation about a 19th century character. I don't want to get into that now. And the librarian came over to me, tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, Marvin, there's, you got a phone call, and the man says he's Edward R. Murrow. And I looked up at the librarian questioningly and said, Liz, Edward R. Murrow is not calling me. Why'd you hang up on the guy? It's probably some quack. No, I don't know whether she did hang up on him or not, but she went away and I kept working. Then she came back at about 5 in the afternoon. She said, Marvin, that same guy has just called back and he says he's Edward R. Murrow. Why don't you talk to him? And I was saying to myself, for what the heck? So I picked myself up, picked up the phone, and the minute I heard his magnificent voice, I realized what a total jackass I had been. And I apologized profusely. And he said, no, nothing like that. No need for that. He said, can you come and see me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, which I did for a half-hour meeting, which lasted 3 hours. Murrow asking me all kinds of questions about Russia, and at the end of which he stood up and he said, I have to go to a lunch now, Marvin. Oh, by the way, putting his arm on my shoulder, he said, by the way, how would you like to join CBS? And Eleanor, it took me a long time, about 2 seconds, to say, yes, sir. And that was, sort of the beginning of a journalism career.
Wow.
As far as Nixon's enemies list, I think that President Nixon was very disturbed by my reporting of the Vietnam War. I had, at the beginning of the war, been a supporter of the war. I thought it was the right thing for the US to do. But after I went there a couple of times, and after listening to my brother's broadcast, he was literally in Vietnam covering the war. I realized that we had put our foot into a terrible mess, that we are not going to win this war. And if you're not going to win it, either get out or negotiate some formula. And we were not doing that. And Nixon felt that he could do it by bombing the North Vietnamese into smithereens. And I did say on the air several times that this was a policy not only in dispute, but on the edge of failure. And it would be wise for the President of the United States to see the error of his ways. And Nixon, let's face it, no president likes to be criticized, and he was. And so he had his own list of people. I was one of them. It was a very distinguished list, by the way. It was not, there were not a bunch of nuts on there. It was a very distinguished list. I was honored to be on it. And I was honored to be on it, but at the same time, it pained me that an American president would waste his time on something so silly. But that's what he wanted to do. He thought also, by the way, getting back to your journalism question, he thought that journalists ought to do everything that was in the national interest of the United States. And I have tried to tell students, my students over many years, that's not the job of the journalist. The citizen of the United States can make up his or her mind anyway. The journalist is there, as I said earlier, to present the information. You use it in the way that you like, but that is my responsibility, is to give you the information. And I thought I was. Look, no one's perfect. I'm sure that I blew a couple of stories here and there, but I tried like hell to do a good job.
Well, this was truly an honor to have you speak this evening, and again, to hear these stories firsthand is you've lived it, so it's quite marvelous to have that opportunity.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you.
And when are you planning on publishing the third portion of your memoir? Because
Yeah,
if you're amenable,
well,
we'd love to have you back to talk about that.
well, that'd be great. I'd love that too. But this is, I'm looking around here. There's still another 6 to 9 months of writing. And then there's always 3 or 4 months before the book gets published. So I think it'll be another year. And I hope that I am able to finish the book so I can at least complete that story. I'd like to do that very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Eleanor, thank you, and thank all of you people for having me tonight. I'm very, very grateful, and you've all been very kind to me, and bless you and be well, and don't anybody catch the bug.
Oh, no, definitely not. And also, I believe your brother's getting ready to celebrate a pretty significant milestone birthday, right? So
Yeah,
I wanna wish him happy
Bernie in
birthday.
a couple of weeks will celebrate his 100th birthday.
Wow, so happy birthday.
Absolutely. I'll tell him you said so. I'll tell him. That's great. Thank you
right.
all, seriously, very much. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. This was awesome. I really appreciate it. Stay safe and,
We will
again,
try.
yes, and have a good evening.
Thank you, you too. Bless.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. Thanks, everyone. We will see you hopefully in February for our next webinar. So have a good evening, everyone.